Hello everybody, it's Mike Yao again with Savage Kingdoms role-playing game and Fire in the Head Productions. So about a week ago I did a video about dragons in the Savage Kingdom setting and also any other tabletop role-playing game setting or fantasy literature setting. Just a general thing about dragons, but with focus on the dragons of Savage Kingdoms, the Savage Kingdoms setting, which is the game I published not too long ago, actually, the third edition. So to show off the core rulebook again, you've probably seen it many times if you watch these videos. Here it is again. And today we're going to talk about, instead of dragons, continuing in this series, we're going to talk about demons and angels. So I was just going to make it about demons and then do maybe an angel one, but in Savage Kingdoms, demons and angels are from the same, I guess, race. It really decided that's what it is, honestly, in my head. And there's a little bit published in the actual books going into some detail. In fact, if you go to page 353, if you own the core rulebook, the book I just showed on camera there, that's really our first kind of mention of demon. Well, it's not the first mention. There's other places in the books. Demons are a fairly popular, iconic thing, and even angels to a lesser degree in sword and sorcery fiction and gaming, and really any kind of fantasy. But particularly in grittier fantasy, I mean, the fact demons are involved in the stories and adventures just shows that it's typically darker fantasy that does it. But the antithesis to that, of course, are angelic beings, whatever they may be called, depending on the setting. In Savage Kingdoms, like I said, they're originally the same race. I haven't really come up with the name of I left it kind of ambiguous on purpose. I might have said this in other videos. I like to leave some things ambiguous for not only for the game master to kind of decide when he runs his or her own campaign, but also I think it's more, quote, realistic that not everything is codified and written down. That kind of annoys me with, say, Dungeons and Dragons sometimes, where everything, it's almost scientific. Every creature has its own type, and yes, I do creature types as well to a lesser degree in Savage Kingdoms, but it just almost makes it too clinical, and it leaves out, I think we forget about the mysticism involved in fantasy, which to me is what makes it one of the things that makes it super interesting. But on page 353, there is this is in the bestiary chapter of the core rulebook of the Savage Kingdoms 3rd edition core rulebook that I just showed. Page 352 is where we go into supernatural creatures. So those of you familiar with the bestiary, I actually set it up in, what did I do? Three different sections. And I debated back and forth how to do this. I was going to do purely alphabetical, like the Monster Manual and Dungeon D&D, and I guess other games do it that way too. But I thought it would be more interesting to put animals, like normal sort of real world animals in a category, and then there's gigantic animals and beasts, and then supernatural creatures has its own thing. Just in my head, I thought that was the best way to do it. Anyway, that's what I chose to do. Whether it's right or wrong doesn't really matter. The fact is that supernatural creatures start on page 352, and the first entrance there is demons, and it says, I won't read the whole thing, but first paragraph or two. These are the denizens of the Nether-world, the lower regions of the Otherworld, the world beyond the mortal realms. Sometimes called devils, nether spawn, or worse. Demons are the embodiments of true evil, almost always filled with lust, violence, and the need to cause chaos, disorder, and general corruption. It is said that even the most wicked mortal soul cannot compare with the sheer evil nature of a demonic creature. That's right. I don't know why I did it that way. Continuing on, demons are often categorized by sorcerers and scholars into 3 types. I just went into like not being clinical, and now I'm doing it myself. But this is for game purposes: lesser, greater, and lords. For game purposes, demons of CL, which means challenge level 7 or less, are considered lesser demons. CL 8 to 12 are greater demons, and CL up at DL, there's a typo. CL 13 plus are assumed to be demon lords or ladies, I suppose. So note that when a demon is slain in the mortal world, its spirit immediately goes screaming back to the netherworld, often with a hint of brimstone in the air. Its mortal remains then quickly corrode away to little more than dust, although certain demonic entities might leave some tracery component behind. see individual demonic or demon statistics, which are later in the chapter. I don't think I have a lot of demons in the bestiary of the core rulebook. I think there's like maybe 3, something like that. We'll delve into that in a second. So just to kind of go back over, unpack those 2 paragraphs, fairly dense paragraphs of that description right there about demons. The first paragraph was more background fluff. I always hate that term, but everybody that uses it. And then the second paragraph is more, the term I hate even worse, crunch. More like game components, game mechanical components. So, yeah, to kind of go back over that, I mentioned that demons are also sometimes called devils. I know in Dungeons and Dragons they make a distinction. There's the chaotic evil fiends and the chaotic or lawful evil fiends, devils. Um, but that's complex, and a lot of very little fantasy literature does it that way. Demons are just sometimes some people refer them devils. Might be that they're all like subcategory of demons. But again, I didn't want to get too clinical. I'll leave that up to the game master. But anyway, a demonic thing is from the Nether-world. The Nether-world is fairly generic description of the hell planes or the abyss in Savage Kingdoms. It is a region of the Otherworld. In other words, it's what we consider a lower region. And that kind of fits in with Judeo-Christianity kind of viewing of lesser, darker spirits are heavy with sin and evil, and they kind of drift to the bottom of the plane, and then the higher, more loftier spirits that are more spiritual have grown into the higher area, and that's where angels are, by the way, which I'll get to in a second. But so again, if you can imagine, there's the Earth world. In D&D terms, I think it's called the Primaterial world, but in Savage Kingdoms, the Earth world, also known as the Mortal world or Mortal planes. The other world is theoretically a world that collided at some point, or is a mirror of that world. And then inside the other world are 3 major regions: the Shadow world, or the Fairy world, sometimes people call it as well. And then there's the upper planes, which are known as the Celestial heavens or the Overworld. And then there is the Netherworld, sometimes called the Underworld, which is where these dark things live. And some people believe corrupted souls of mortals might drift into that plane as well and sink to the lower regions, sunken, laden down with sin and evil. Right. So those are demons, and then and game mechanics. You have lesser, greater, and lords, right? So these are the 3 categories, and mostly that's broken down because there's a demon summoning spell, or for game mechanical reasons when a game master is designing an adventure. Maybe like, I kind of want a greater demon here instead of a lesser one. See how range is that? Oh, that's 8 to 12. Usually that sounds quite good, so I'll do that then. Whatever. Yeah, and then it also explains that when a demon dies, at least in this setting, that and I think I've seen this in other settings too. It's not that unusual, not that unique. It's the body corrodes very quickly, and I think to me that's very important in my brain and fantasy literature wise, that creature not of this world, our world, the Earth world, doesn't quite belong there. So its fleshly form begins to become the base element that it was very quickly, and leaving perhaps some tracery component. And the reason I like that in there, I think that's a cool visual of this scourge of blackness left in the grass or wherever it is, maybe in the sands of a desert. There's glass components that remain from all the intense heat and horribleness of the creature that was there. The symbolic meaning there, I think, meaning that this unnatural thing was there, and it's gonna leave a scourge or a scar on the earth for its having its presence being there, and it probably shouldn't be there. So that's why it's called a supernatural creature, right, and not a natural creature. So going on to angels. So right under that paragraph, same page 352, core rulebook, and there's some stuff in the Savage East, the secondary book, right, as well about demons and Oni, which I'll get to in a second if I remember. Um, Oni. So, in fact, let's do that right now because those are considered demons as well. They're just kind of like a subcategory. So before I go into angels, let me cover Oni really quick. So the idea of Oni, and those of you who are familiar with particularly Japanese mythology, and I'm not super familiar to be honest, but I do kind of know enough. And what I did with Savage Kingdoms anyway, and this is not unique. A lot of writers and game designers kind of do this. They'll take a general concept of something, and they might kind of change. So they'll even use like the same name, like Oni, and they use the general concept, right? Because we're kind of respecting the culture and the mythology that it came from. But we have to kind of make it a little bit our own to fit into this particular world because we're not. I mean, the Savage Kingdoms is not ancient Japan, right? But it does have parts of that in it, right? To make it interesting and also to kind of honor that culture as well, like all the other kind of cultures that we're sort of taking sprinklings from here and there. And though they are not that culture, to be clear, we do take some inspiration from that because that is what's called templating in the human brain. So if you say that your character's from a Japanese, your character's from Yanakan, which is a Japanese kind of ancient Japanese culture, you already have in your head some imagery and some things you can play with without having to go like into tons and tons of detail. But now that's out of the way, so I feel like nowadays I have to kind of clarify that, sort of sadly, but there it is. All right, so Oni and the Savage Bestiary. So basically, before I even find the page, I'm just going to find you the little description thingy. So in the Savage East, that's this book right here, right? This is the second book that came out in the Savage Kingdom's third edition game line, the Savage East. And it does cover, as per the book title says, it does cover the eastern region of the world, particularly the continent of Hassan, but also a little bit to do with Imanju as well, which is kind of the African-inspired continent. But Hassan is an Eastern-inspired continent, and it's covers, to be kind of generic and use real world kind of terms, like mid east to near to all the way to far east, which is really more of an Oni thing, because again, it's kind of borrowing a little bit from Japanese mythology. So Oni, here we go. Oh, there's it's a fairly big chunk, so I'll just read a little bit of it. Essentially, demons of the Far East. Oni are demonic and often gorgonic or chimeric beings, a mixture of the netherworldly and mortal evil. Often they are a hybrid of several creatures in appearance, usually with sick or carnal appetites like true demons, and guiles and motivations to rival many a nobleman. Some of the more notable ones have spider like forms or appear as large ogre things, or creatures with multiple arms or heads. It is said that virtually all Oni found their way into the mortal world by way of the Forbidden Lands in the far northeast of Hassan, the eastern continent that we were just talking about, where many have remained, making a strange and eldritch home for themselves among the great mountains, vales, volcanoes, and rocky shores there. As such, few mortals venture into this nightmarish land. That was just a little aside in parentheses. Let's see, without reading, just really quickly, Oni are known to have a weakness against jade, and as such, jade amulets, even weapons, are often constructed by civilized realms bordering Oni territories. Generally, jade weaponry either bypass an Oni's natural resistances or deals additional damage to them. Note, however, there is rumored to be a type of black jade that some believe is actually obsidian that does not affect Oni, and in fact may actually benefit them in some way. In brief, a true demon is often a creature of Western, Near Eastern, or Southern myth, while an Oni is generally more specific to the cultures of the Far East, such as Taikanara, Yanakan, and Yuntilla. Yet such beings follow such boundaries. Such beings do not follow such boundaries, and so an Oni creature would appear virtually anywhere in the world, in the known and unknown world. So even though I said I wasn't going to read the whole thing, I just literally did. So, right. So all four paragraphs were read there about Oni. This is on page 174 in the Savage Bestiary chapter or section of the Savage East book. So there you go. So that kind of sums it up. So one of the main one mechanical difference between a demon and Oni, and again, really kind of think of them almost as the same thing. Perhaps the people in the East, that's really just kind of their name for demon, and really that's kind of where I'm going from. But there are a few little minor differences. So jade can affect an Oni type of demon, kind of like cold iron and silver might affect other supernatural creatures. And I kind of borrowed that from, there's some games that kind of, but also there's a little bit, I don't think it's a major thing about Japanese mythology, might be even kind of like a counter mythology, where yeah, they're repelled by jade. No, actually, I think it's like somewhat well known in Japan. Anyway, doesn't matter. For Savage East, for Savage Kingdoms, we're using that sort of lore where jade, particularly pure jade, can repel oni creatures or supernatural creatures in general, perhaps. So that's a little side note about Oni. Just know that they're just kind of, I guess the only other thematic difference, it says kind of in the first paragraph. So if you can imagine if Western demons or the Western idea of demons are more like pure, like the biblical sins almost is the way I kind of look at them. Oni are more like kind of earth demons. They're almost more chimeric, more like shapeshifters, perhaps even more trickster like. So, yeah, there you go. Okay, on to angels, because I don't want to make this video super huge, but I do want to pack some material in it because I don't really make a lot of these videos right now. So, um, angels, page 352 of the bestiary in the core rulebook. Angels, in the history of the SK world, demons and angels are members of the same ancient and essentially immortal race, which I mentioned earlier at the top of the video. However, some eons ago, likely during the Age of God, some demons began to turn from their dark and sinister ways, becoming as ascended forms of their race that would become known as angels. These angelic beings were still greatly outnumbered by their evil brethren, but many of them were powerful or grew powerful in their decision to ascend to a higher sense of honor and morality. In fact, there is no such thing as a lesser angel, only greater and Lord versions of them exist, okay, mechanically speaking. Because even like a minor angel would be a pretty power, like this equivalent of like a greater demon in most cases. So, all right, and to yeah, I pretty much that it's all packed into that. It was really just one big paragraph. I probably should have put it into two paragraphs, but anyway, that's how it came out. But the layout, um, just to unpack it a little bit. So they are members of the same race. Again, I haven't really named the race, but if you can think in like real world terms, I'm thinking of like the Anunnaki, which are mentioned in the Book of Enoch, in the well, not in the official Bible, but in some of the alternate versions of the Bible. Um, and in other parts, Revelation is kind of mentioned as well, but more symbolically. But anyway, that possibly the Anunnaki were all the same race, and then like some of the ones that were kind of corrupt might have become what we would call demons, biblically speaking, and perhaps in fantasy as well. And the ones that kind of ascended and became more helpful to their possible children, mankind or humankind, they were might be referred to angels later on. So you might have noticed too in Judeo-Christian religion, and some people might say mythology, but I actually think there's a lot of truth to it, uh, that one third of the heavenly host fell to earth, right? They were cast out of heaven, became corrupt, and so they became demons, right? Or devils eventually, or the devil, as we would say. So, as you might have noticed, in Savage Kingdoms, I reversed the lore of that. So, in Savage Kingdoms, demons were first. They were all sort of these horrible things. And then angels, one third of that host actually ascended and became angelic beings. So basically, I kind of reversed the Judeo Christian sort of template of that. So just to be different. And also, I wanted to do this thing. You'll see that in a lot of sword and sorcery, because this is it's not a pure sword and sorcery setting anymore, as you might notice. That's why I kind of call it a Dark Ages fantasy. It's kind of sword and sorcery, but it kind of is almost its own thing. I probably wouldn't really quite call it high fantasy, although you do have stuff like, you do have Dwargar, which are dwarves, and the Shi, which are elves in there as well, but they don't feature super prominently in the stories often in Savage Kingdoms. But what I'm getting at, in sword and sorcery, you rarely get mention of an angel or angelic creature. The Tower of the Elephant in the famous Conan story is one example, but it's never even mentioned. This elephant-headed being it is mentioned that he's perhaps from celestial origin, but he's never really said whether he's an angel. I always got the feeling he was more like a lesser god, super ancient, probably used to be worshipped. Recently, he was probably summoned by the sorcerer. If you know the story, it's one of my favorite Conan stories of the original Robert Heath Howard saga, and was probably trapped by this powerful sword. I can't remember the sorcerer's name, and I've read the story like 20 times. I'll remember it later. Um, and so probably has him trapped in his bejeweled tower, where Conan is kind of hired to go steal this jewel from the Tower of the Elephant. And anyway, that's a really cool story, but it does mention this elephant-headed creature, which you think at first is kind of a trick, because in Conan, usually it's like, oh, this is usually a weird bestial thing is usually an enemy, right? But it ends up being he's really not. Conan kind of feels sorry for him, but he's this ancient being from across the multiverse, from beyond the void, beyond the stars. In other words, kind of a cool way to describe it's just an unknown being that really nobody has any kind of knowledge of. This sorcerer that trapped him probably really doesn't know a lot about him either, but he probably keeps him there in order to learn secrets and to gain knowledge from him and that sort of thing as he tortures him. It's never really said why he's tortured specifically in the story, but I always got the feeling it did kind of hint at that he was probably trying to milk information and lore and forbidden spells out of this elephantine creature. So that could be, in other words, what I'm getting at. That could be another form of angelic creature as well. In fact, I keep wanting to create. Maybe I'll do that later this week when I get this show that I'm currently in rehearsal for open, but maybe work on an angelic sort of race that might feature like an elephant head. And that, and probably Howard was pulling from Hindu or Hindi, or Hindu actually is a religion, from Hindu mythology slash religion, where you do have these, elephants were considered very sacred in India and Thailand and a lot of parts of Indonesia and that parts of the real world. And so he might have been pulling from that. He was a big fan of mythology and cultures from all around the world, not just Western, but even Eastern as well. So, yeah. So that's the little thing about angels. Another cool thing about angels and my setting, my players. I run a lot of games in the Kingdom of Malovia. A lot of people seem to love Malovia. It's very gothic when you get to talking accents like this, whatever. Um, and so and also further north, say in Scathia and Norland, even Volnarok on the other, across the ocean on the other continent, Hassan had a little bit of that as well. So anyway, in the northern cultures tend to call the angels the Valkyr. So Valkyr, I think is how I decided to spell it. Valkyr, and I kind of I think when I first named them, I didn't mean to do it, but then I realized that subconsciously I attached that name to the Valkyrie, which is kind of cool because those are kind of Nordic angels, battle angels that Odin sent down to gather, collect the souls of the fallen, right? And so I didn't, I remember recall not doing that on purpose. I just kind of subconsciously, and then one day I was like, wait a minute, that might be too close to Valkyrie actually. Maybe I should change it back. But it was already, I think it's actually, I don't even think that name is published, but in the books. But it's just out there now, so I just kind of leave it. And maybe it's cool that it's kind of attached to it. But instead of Valkyrie, which is how we usually pronounce it, I just call them the Valkyr, Val, Latin Val, which is probably more of the Nordic pronunciation, the Valkyr. So, and it's just basically just a fancy name, the northern name for angels. Demons, I haven't really come up with a special name that the Northmen use. I think they just say demons no matter what. All right. And again, going back to demons really quick. So you'll notice in fantasy literature, particularly in sword and sorcery, but really most any kind of fantasy, um, and in history as well, in mythology, that demon is a very broad term. So often cultures, when they encounter something they can't explain, whether it's deep out in the forest or not even in the forest, deep in a swamp or on a forlorn mountaintop, or maybe right at the edge of a village, something they can't quite explain, often would just be labeled a demon. And demon basically is an old word. It's not necessarily attached to evil. It kind of is now. But if you look at ancient texts, particularly in Hindu, the term demon and deva, which is like a lesser form of angel, often they're almost very much the same. Like they're very similar. And so, in that broad sense, demon really kind of means any kind of supernatural creature, but it does have an evil, dark taint to it because, our ancestors back in the day, and even us now, we encounter something of the unknown, and there's that part of your reptile brain that's like, danger, this could be dangerous. I don't know anything about it. This could be dangerous. I'm going to assume it's evil. I know that's what we would call nowadays maybe profiling or whatever, But there actually is some good sense to that. You should probably already default to, just to be sure, that something's going to be possibly after you or a rival to you. And then when it's proven that it's not, then you can have negotiations, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, that's where a lot of that came from. The word demon really just kind of meant any kind of supernatural thing that really couldn't be explained later on. And then as humankind, explored its world in the real world, and even in Savage Kingdoms and other worlds, very similar stories. Things became known, and that's when things became a little more quantified, even though I'm kind of against codifying stuff too much in a game mechanical sense. But anyway, eventually people were able to discern that that's not really a demon. That's actually a creature that's of the natural environment. We just don't see them that often. They're really rare. So in other words, they're mortal. They're from this realm, this world. Um, and then dragons. Now there's certain things like dragons, like the video I did last week is probably obvious. I don't think they've ever not usually associated with demons. There is a reference to, the dragon representing the devil in the Bible, and there's a few other obscure references in other religions, but for the most part, they're kind of clearly their own thing. Same with undead creatures. Probably only rarely associated with demons or demonic activity. The Fae, however, especially the unseelie Fae, right, the dark Fae, probably are somewhat often associated with demons because they're often associated with shadow and darkness, and they can be tricksters and very deceitful, which is very demonic as well, but usually not to the hard, corrupted sense that demons would go to. So, in other words, when you're role playing a demon, and remember, this is all acting, this is all theater, this is all role playing, because nobody would really want to be like this. I should hope, right? But demons are they'll do anything to take their advantage. They just think of anything that we think that's good and right in the world that we want to strive to be better people. Demons are the opposite of that, and that's kind of another thing they sort of represent, right? Um, so yeah, so they represent, like it said in the lust and sloth and gluttony, all of these kind of typically negative traits, right? Now, in very small measures, those traits can be okay, but if they get away from you, they're not so good, right? Some things are obvious, demons that just want to murder you. But that's also could be a trope, so be careful with that. That's a bit of a trope. It's like, I see that a lot in role playing games, particularly with the younger kids, because they're still exploring their world, their brains are still developing. And sometimes when they portray evil, it's always the same, I just want to kill you, without really thinking why, right? But that's the thing about a demon, though, they often don't really need a why. So if you ever want to play this crazy villain that like a mortal villain, for example. And I know as an actor I've played villains before, and I have to come up with a reason. Remember, a villain doesn't seldom believes that they are evil, right? So you have to come up. I know as an actor, you have to come up with a reason why. This is why this character is doing that, because he firmly believes that this is for the greater good or whatever. Kind of a Thanosian sort of character. But demons, a lot of times their motivations just literally pure, just they want to see the world burn, they want to see everything topple. They're kind of jealous. Jealousy is a good thing to play with them. That's probably an underlying motivation. They're jealous of the angels that have risen above them. Probably they're jealous of the gods, should they exist, because in Savage Kingdoms I deliberately made it where they really may not exist. Maybe it's just a concept of them. Maybe it's just the priest. Maybe it's just the belief in the gods that makes them kind of real. So anyway, stuff to kind of role play and think about when you're considering demons and angels as well. So now angels are the opposite of that. They are what most of us would strive to become, and kind of even beyond that. Like, would probably never get there, right? Because we're made of flesh, and we're carnal, and we're mortal, and we're fallible and that sort of thing. Where these creatures are basically perfection. I would say, though, it is boring playing a angelic creature or any creature that is perfection. That is just I find that super boring. So when you're role playing an angel, make sure, yes, they might be honorable and straightforward, but they also might have their own motivations, and they may not necessarily be horribly evil motivations, but they might want something out of a situation if you encounter one or manage to summon one, because they're a little more difficult to summon. They can be summoned by the demon summoning spell because again they were originally of the same race. But as you'll notice in the spell description, the DLs are 5 higher, so it is harder, a little more complicated, and more difficult to summon an angel. But if it comes forth to help you, it might want something in return as well, right? Um, so just think about that when you're playing angelic beings. I think they're more interesting. And you see this in literature, television as well. I know modern television often, a lot of it isn't written particularly well, but some of the stuff that is written well is really cool. It deals with, what was the show? Supernatural. My wife and I really like. Yeah, it could be a little cheesy, but some of it's also really cool. And you'll see a lot of supernatural creatures used with human motivations in that. So that's also a good inspiration for maybe putting a little more humanity in when you're role playing demons and angels. But again, demons you can go completely over the top depending on the comfort level of your group. Because again, you're dealing with some evil stuff. It's fantasy, we all understand, but make sure everybody's comfortable at the table. Angels, you can go a little over top too, but maybe leave a little room for humanity. And remember, they were of that lower race as well. The same race, but the lower version of that race. In other words, demons at some point. And I try to make that clear with my players when they've dealt with angels, which has been rare, but they have. That you can't really trifle with them. I mean, they might be good in honor, but they have their own thing. They probably get annoyed with mortal folks from time to time because we're kind of like children to them, and meaning that we love children, we like to nurture them and help them, but they can also get under our skin super easy if we're not careful. So, um, yeah, I think that's I've said enough about demons. Probably. Actually, I'll leave it with this one last thing. So there are. I just want to go into a couple of different types of demons. I know I mentioned like sloth and lust demons and all this stuff. I didn't really divide demons specifically in that category. I thought about doing it that way. There's a few new designs of them I'm actually working on for maybe another upcoming book that go more specifically into that. But anyway, so there's a plague demons are a thing. So um, yeah, plague demons they're pretty cool. They can cause plague in like a mile radius, and it's fun when they appear because you can describe like bugs and flies around them and centipedes crawling at their feet and stuff like that. It's kind of fun. The grass around them and plants around them are just blighted and blackened and barren. And then there's like a lava demon I kind of struggled with because I wanted to make a lava titan because you do in Greek mythology you do see these titanic creatures that are associated with volcanoes, and but I ended up creating a demon called a lava demon. I wanted this kind of pure creature of flame and fire, shadow and fire, the Balrog, but not exactly that. More literal elemental, and it can throw globs of lava and that kind of stuff. And it's not as particularly as smart as say like a plague demon. Blade demon is probably one of my favorite. I think it's most of my players' favorite. It's a multi four-armed demon with 4 blades. You probably see this imagery, and again in Hindu mythology in particular. Some of them even have 6 arms. They're called blade demons because, or sword demons. They are always armed, and they're just spinning swords around, cutting people up. They often have 2 faces, one face on either side, which is another kind of Hindu um, sort of thing. So those are kind of cool. And there's other types of demons too. I'm currently working in the Heroic Adventures book. There'll be something called a blood demon. Gosh, what else? So there's sand demons. The sand demon I kind of came up. It was kind of it's probably almost more of an oni because it's part elemental, sand, which is air and earth. But I wanted to be. I know in one of the Conan stories there was like this sand demon that kind of spun up out of the desert and was kind of cool. So I got the concept of that. Shadow demons are pretty interesting. They're usually used as assassins because they're shadowy, so they blend into the darkness, very stealthy. And so shadow demons would often be used by demon lords to capture people or to like assassinate people. And then speaking of assassins, there's hellcats. Hellcats are really cool. Big black, solid black panther things with like green flame eyes, although you can describe it with regular orangish red flame eyes if you want. Um, and they're also very quiet, stealthy. Think of a big hulking panther that's super quiet, very strong. So, and then lastly, I would mention nether hounds, uh, also known as hellhounds in other games, and they're called that in the setting too. But I kind of changed it to nether hound just to be a little bit different. So, right, but anyway, they're basically like hellhounds. I think that's about it. I just wanted to cover a few of the actual demons. Now that we're at 35 minutes, I think that's enough. Hopefully, you guys got something out of this. The last dragon video did pretty well, so it kind of spurred me on to do another video in this kind of series. So this one was about about demons and angels, which were originally of the same race. So yeah, hopefully, get some stuff out of this. Uh, some of this could, most of this, in fact, could apply to Dungeons and Dragons and other fantasy tabletop role playing games. But again, this is mostly Savage Kingdom specific. Right. All right. Thanks to those of you guys that made it this far in the video. Please like, subscribe, and share, and all that jazz. And I'll talk to you again in the next one.